Of all the Studio Ghibli films, Howl's Moving Castle is surely one of the most romantic, telling the love story between the humble hatter Sophie and the wizard Howl. But rewatching the film, what I found really interesting was the relationship between love and lies, because almost everyone in this film is duplicitous. I don't mean that in a negative way. It's not that they're malicious schemers or trying to manipulate people, it's just that everyone is living some sort of double life, whether it's hiding their name, their appearance, or even lying to themselves about who they are. And what's really beautiful about the film is that love is the thing that seems to pierce through all the lies and pretense. And it is love that ultimately brings everything together. So I'd like to talk to you about how it's okay for us all to be lying and pretending sometimes, because the message of Howl's Moving Castle is that that's what society makes us do. It's what we need to do to survive, sometimes literally. But what the film also tells us is that love is the beautiful, powerful force that allows us to make sense of all these contradictions within ourselves and how we all need a little more love in our lives. Now I'm going to talk about Sophie's love in this video because obviously it's not only the most prominent part of the film, but her love is also the most powerful force in the movie. Sophie's love is her form of magic. But we'll do that at the end, because I first want to describe the various other kinds of love that we see throughout the film. When I say love, I don't just mean romantic love, because within Howl's Moving Castle, we have lots of different kinds of love. We have protective love, possessive love, familial love, the love between master and pupil, and even patriotic love. All of these come with their own nuances and their own form of lies. But as is maybe apt for a video about Howl's Moving Castle, we'll start with Howl and end with Sophie. Howl is fascinating as a character, not just because he's so obviously dreamy and desirable, but because he's also the most duplicitous, meaning he's the one who lies the most in the film. The very way in which Howl lives his life is a lie. He has multiple names for starters, the wizard Pendragon in some places, Jenkins in another, and of course his real name of Howl. In one town, he's basically a local shaman, providing powders and remedies for various problems that the townspeople have, and in another town, Sophie's hometown for example, he's known as a wicked man who devours the hearts of beautiful young girls. In the capital of Kingsbury, meanwhile, he's got a reputation as a renowned wizard. His hair color's fake too, and he's incredibly vain in regards to it, and even his very humanity is in doubt. Is he a talented wizard, or is he a monster, destined to be a threat to society? The thing about the film is that, actually, none of this is a bad thing. Howl's multiple personalities and identities are actually just a means for him to have the one thing that he desires most at the start of the film: freedom. At one point, Sophie asks him how many names he has, and Howl simply replies, "As many as I need to be free." I think this is an incredibly understandable instinct, one that we can all relate to. All Howl wants is the freedom to live his life in his own way, as he desires. Because while he's described as a coward, what we learn over the course of the film is that a lot of people want something from Howl. Yes, he creates his elaborate moving castle and these fake names to hide away from society and his responsibilities, but it's either that or becomes someone else's pawn. Madame Suleiman wants him to be her successor and become the king's wizard. The king himself wants Howl's powers to help him win his war, and the Witch of the Waste wants to basically take and own Howl, something we'll talk about later. And all of these people are not exactly nice about being told no. Without his lies, Howl might actually be dead. And so that's what I mean about the message of the film not being critical of the various lies and multiple personalities he has to maintain. Because it's the same for all of us in a way. We all have to be different people sometimes just to get by. Who we are at work, who we are with our friends, who we are with strangers. We have to don various faces to navigate society's different challenges. What's also really fascinating about the film though is that there's a theme throughout of people being after Howl's heart, literally. Sophie's tucking the Witch of the Waste into bed and asks her if she's ever been in love, to which she replies that she actually currently is, and through little dialogue cues, we can understand that what she's saying is that she's in love with Howl. So she has a romantic desire for him, but also literally wants his heart, as we see during the climax when she grabs it and refuses to let go. We can see both these things in evidence when she sends the note to Howl early on in the film, which simply reads, "He who catches a falling star, your heart shall be mine." The falling star is Calcifer, and so the witch is declaring her desire to take Howl's heart, both metaphorically and literally. When Sophie goes to the royal palace, she's told by Madame Suliman that the Witch of the Waste gave her own heart away to a demon and lost her soul. And in the original book that the film is based on, that demon is also after Howl's heart because it wants to possess him as a new body. Calcifer, meanwhile, is also someone who wants Howl's physical heart, having struck a bargain to take it from him in exchange for lending him his power. And yet, paradoxically, despite all of this, Howl is also accused of not having a heart. In that same palace visit, Madame Suliman tells Sophie that while Howl is a wonderful wizard, he's far too powerful for one with no heart. She believes that a demon, who we know as Calcifer, is making Howl use his magic for purely selfish purposes, and that she needs to stop him before he completely turns into a monster. This is one of the central recurring themes in the film, and what I think is so brilliant about Howl's moving castle. I'll call it the paradoxes of personhood. The idea that people are two or more contradictory things at the same time is actually just taken as a fact of reality in the film. Much like the castle he calls a home, Howl is everything, everywhere, all at once. That's why the castle is also the central metaphor of the film. The castle is simultaneously in Port Haven, in Kingsbury, and marching through the waste, and yet also it's in none of these places when it chooses to be. It is a castle, and yet also a humble home to a bunch of unruly boys. It's a magical, powerful force, and it's also a pile of junk that's barely being held together. It is at once sophisticated enough to keep its owner protected from the most powerful wizard in the land, and yet easily found and entered by a feeble old lady. These various facets of the castle are not contradictions. They are all a part of the whole. All of these things are the castle. And the same applies to Howl. He is at once a monster with no heart, but also a beautiful, charming wizard who every woman wants to love. I think this is the film's message to and for all of us, that we all live like this. We all have within us multiple selves, and we often struggle to accept what we really are. All of these can be very different, but that doesn't mean that they're contradictory. We are all of these things and none of these things. We don't need to define ourselves as only being one way. Where the film goes one step further is in how true love ties in with all of this. As I said earlier, there are forms of love that aren't romantic. And the witch's love for Howl, for example, is what I'd call possessive love. She's not particularly interested in who Howl actually is. She's after some rather superficial things, namely his charming appearance and just the literal taking control of his heart. We see the end of the film that the witch quickly moves on to the turnip-turned-prince when she sees how handsome he is. Her love for Howl is not genuine, and so she's only able to see him how she wants to see him. Similarly, Madame Suliman's accusations are rather ironic because while she accuses Howl of being selfish, she herself only wants to use Howl. She wants him to replace her, but not just that, it's clear that she too wants to own and possess him. Throughout the palace, she's made a bunch of imitation Howls, little boys who look exactly like him. And at one point, when she forces Sophie's mother to be a spy for her, even the secret agent driver she sent looks like Howl too, this time more like a teenage version. So Madame Suliman too is only able to see Howl as a weapon, as something to be used for its power. And she keeps trying to create versions of him in the hopes of having this one thing that she craves. We can see this as another more toxic form of love, the relationship between a master and student gone wrong, that contrasts sharply with the same relationship Howl has with Markl. We'll talk about that later in this video. Now compare all of this with the love that Howl shares with Sophie. Sophie doesn't try to see Howl as one thing, and she very easily could. After all, her impression of him is initially based on his reputation that he's an evil wizard who steals the hearts of beautiful women. But when she actually spends time with him, she learns to accept him for all his quirks and personality traits. In the monologue she gives back to Madame Suliman, she tells her that yes, Howl is selfish and cowardly and unpredictable, but he's straight as an arrow, and all he wants is to be free. She believes that he won't turn into a monster, and even when later in the film, she sees that that's a possibility that could come true, she simply tells Howl, "I don't care if you're a monster, I love you, I just want to help you." Sophie, unlike basically every other woman in Howl's life, accepts him for who he is: the monster, the wizard, the coward, the hero, the beautiful man, the petulant man-child. And that's a funny part of this too, because Howl is at once an adult and a child. This contradiction exists in two ways, physically and metaphorically. Let's first talk about the metaphorical, which is how Howl behaves like both a child and an adult. He seems to shy away from responsibility like a child might, but is also so powerful that he's able to hinder the war effort basically single-handedly. We meet him in the film as a hero who's in control and literally sweeps Sophie off of her feet, but then he's also hiding from his own problems and has Sophie fight his battle with the king for him, and tellingly, while pretending to be his mother. Sometimes he's incredibly calm and in control, but then sometimes he'll throw an absolute tantrum over something small, like when his hair is dyed the wrong color. That's because, like everything else, Howl's heart is a paradox too. When Sophie is returning Howl's heart to him, she says to Calcifer that it feels all fluttery and warm like a little bird, to which Calcifer replies that it is still a child's heart. This is the physical contradiction. What we learn from the little time traveling that Sophie does in the film is that Calcifer was a shooting star that Howl caught when he was still a child, and from that point on, they've been together. And so if we look at that literally, we're to understand that Howl's heart has been caught in a sort of limbo or stasis, never getting the chance to actually mature, leaving him with the body of an adult and the heart of a child. But I don't think the message of the film is that Howl is literally a kid. The way I interpret this is a lot more poetically. Whether it's literally a child's heart or not, Howl is just a person who wants to live freely, as we discussed earlier. And that's something that the world doesn't allow. The world is constantly putting burdens and expectations on all of us, crushing our hopes and our optimism till we become worn down and jaded. This is basically the process we all inevitably go through in changing from optimistic, bright-eyed children to world-weary adults. But Howl resists all of that in an attempt to live how he wants to live. And so Howl's desires are in some way childish in that they don't want to be shackled by society's responsibilities. But again, paradoxically, the film ends with Howl accepting that he does have certain responsibilities. He can't run away forever, and once again, it's love that allows him to unify his childish desires with his adult responsibilities. It is his feelings for Sophie that give him the courage he needs. And we see that when he's able to confront Madame Suleiman, and he tells Sophie, "Your presence gave me the courage to face her." He even goes further and tells her that, "You saved me. I was in big trouble back there," because Madame Suleiman tries to expose the monster within Howl. She tells Sophie she's going to show her who Howl really is, and forces the monster out from within him. But Sophie calls out to Howl and reminds him that he doesn't have to be this creature Madame Suleiman maintains he is. But that's how she's able to save and unify Howl. Later, it is for Sophie that Howl goes out to fight, and he says flat out, "I finally found someone I want to protect. You, Sophie." His love for and the love he gets from Sophie is what saves Howl from falling into the trap of viewing himself as just one thing. He's not just a child or an adult. He's not just a coward or a hero. He's not just a monster or a wizard. He is all these things. And Sophie is the only one who understands and accepts all of this, which is what allows Howl to learn to accept and love all of himself. Now, isn't that a beautiful message? Let's talk next about the Witch of the Waste, who also shares these literal and metaphorical contradictions. Most obviously, there's her age. When we first encounter her, she's a relatively young and vain woman who tries to keep an air of mystery and arrogance about her. But after her encounter in the royal palace, she's forcibly turned into her real age and becomes a feeble, senile old woman. Age is actually a really fascinating theme in Howl's Moving Castle because the film has such a fluid relationship with it. Firstly, I can't think of another animated film with so many cool, powerful old women in Madame Suleiman, the Witch, and of course, Sophie. But with the latter two, their age shifts a lot throughout the film, both literally and metaphorically. Like we just discussed, the Witch's age is forcibly changed, but her behavior changes a lot too. For large chunks of the film, she's helpless and barely in control of her senses. When Sophie takes her in, she's like this sweet old grandma that can't do anything for herself. But then in this scene, when Sophie's mother arrives, the Witch of the Waste suddenly kicks into action. Not only does she instantly sense the threat from Madame Suleiman's bug and takes care of it, but look at how physically nimble she is all of a sudden. She not only deals with this threat, but then she pulls out a goddamn cigar and starts puffing it up like a mafia boss. She suddenly becomes really sassy and demanding too. A couple scenes later, she shows off her powers of premonition again when she warns Markl that if he opens the door, Madame Suleiman will find them, and that's exactly what happens. And yet, after all of this, she goes back to being kind of feeble and senile clutching onto Howl's heart like a moth to a flame, even at the risk of ruining everything for everyone else. Once again, I think love is the unifying factor here, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to talking about Sophie. But I think the witch is at her most lucid when she's motivated by love. After catching the worm spy thing that Madame Suleiman sent, the witch proudly declares, "I won't let Madame Suleiman have Howl." Again, this is these two older women wrestling for a rather selfish, possessive love and control for Howl. But it is nonetheless love that springs the witch into action. And when Howl returns, she's still lucid because she wants Howl to promise him that they'll have a little heart-to-heart conversation later, to which he agrees. But once that's over, she goes back to being kinda helpless. At the end of the film, when she's feeble and senile again, it's actually Sophie's love that gets through to her. We see that Howl is dying and Sophie needs to get his heart back from the witch, but she's holding on to it stubbornly. This is what happens when love becomes destructive. It will literally kill the object of her affection, and yet the witch won't stop holding on. But it's the perfect chance to contrast this with Sophie's love, who is warm, kind, and gentle. She softly walks over and asks politely, and when the witch refuses, she doesn't react with anger or try to force the heart away from her. She just shows her more love, hugging and asking again to please give her the heart back. And you can see the message of the film come through clearly here, because all of a sudden, the witch looks lucid once more as she says, "You really want this, huh?" And then quietly, she returns the heart back to Sophie. Where her toxic, possessive love is keeping her senile and threatening to ruin everything, Sophie's warm and compassionate love is able to get through to her and save the day. And indeed, it's Sophie's love that reconciles the witch's character as well. Because at the start of the film, the witch is basically the main villain of the piece. She's the one chasing Howl, she's the one who curses Sophie, and she's the one that sends that ominous note to Howl that burns itself into his table. So we as the audience might be inclined to hate her and think of her as the bad guy to be defeated. But I've spoken in previous videos at length about how Studio Ghibli avoids portraying good and evil and painting any character as an unambiguous villain. So you can go watch those if you want to know how and why this happens. Also, while you're here, since you've watched this video this far, please do consider subscribing to the channel and supporting me directly via Patreon. I try to keep all my videos ad-free, so if you want to help me keep this channel as purely a place for honest, heartfelt video analysis, then please consider signing up. The link to my Patreon is in the video description. Patrons also get lots of benefits like early access to videos, so please do consider supporting. Now, going back to the witch, we once more see a demonstration of duality here. She starts as the villain, but ends as part of the family. Thanks to Sophie. She's old and young, senile and lucid, protective and a threat, selfish and giving. Like pretty much everything else in the film, she defies easy categorization because human beings are not like that. We are very rarely just one thing, we're always many parts of a whole. Next, let's round out the family by talking about Markl. Markl, of course, also has a duality to him, but despite being an actual kid, he also has a really interesting relationship with age. While normally Markl looks like, well, a kid, when he faces customers, he puts on this appearance, that of an old man. He even speaks in this voice that he obviously thinks makes him sound old and wise, but it's just kind of super cute for us watching. He doesn't explicitly explain why in the film, but in the book, Markl, or Michael as he's named originally, talks about needing to use this older appearance so that he'll be taken seriously. Even though in the book, he's a teenager, he worries that if people see such a young-looking wizard's apprentice, they won't think much of him. This is a really interesting contrast to how a lot of characters feel about old age in the film. For example, the witch. She's desperately trying to look younger so that she can feel glamorous and beautiful. Similarly, Sophie is initially of the opinion that looking old makes her undesirable, though she never felt that beautiful in the first place. I think this is a really poignant illustration of basically how the grass is always greener. When you're a kid, you can't wait to grow up and be older, and it always feels like it's adults who get to have all the fun and freedom to do whatever they want. But we've already spoken about how that's not quite true in the film or in reality. And on the opposite end of things, adults always look back fondly at their youth, thinking about all the things that they've lost rather than all the things that they've gained. In Markl's case, it's quite sad that he basically thinks people won't treat him well unless he changes who he is. What's interesting though is that literally from the first moment we meet him, he doesn't keep up this pretense with Sophie. In this, his first appearance, he rushes downstairs to answer the door, sees Sophie sleeping, and dons his disguise. Then once he's answered the guess, he takes off his disguise to talk to Sophie. By contrast, look at this cute little girl who he answers the door for right after. With her, he still keeps his fake persona up, even though he seems to have dealt with her several times before and feels comfortable enough to let her into the house. Sophie, meanwhile, is a stranger. Again, I think this is just a nod to the idea of love and family. It's like Markl knows somehow that he can trust the loving Sophie, and we'll elaborate on this later when we talk about her in the last section. But what's clear is that Sophie is, once again, the one person who's able to unify these dualities within other characters. In this scene towards the end of the film, Sophie and Markl are stood outside the castle now that it's been relocated to Sophie's old home, and again, Markl is keeping up his disguise. Not only is he wearing the appearance of an old man, but he also keeps talking in his old man voice, even though it's no one but them within earshot. This, I think, is not only Markl's fear and self-doubt that no one will take him seriously if he's not in this form, but I also think it's his attempt to seem mature and nonchalant to Sophie because of what he's discussing with her. The two of them are talking about how so many people are evacuating their homes, and this comes right after Sophie was just reunited with her mother. So Markl asks Sophie if she will run too. When she looks confused, he continues that he heard Sophie's mother say that she wants Sophie to come live with her in her new home with her new husband. Sophie, obviously not intending to leave, doesn't directly respond to his question and instead just says, "Right, I'm glad I made up with her." At which point, Markl can't contain his real emotions anymore. He drops the disguise and flings himself at Sophie, pleading with her not to go. "I love you, Sophie, please stay," is his request, and notably, he drops his old man voice to say this. Sophie tells him that she loves him too and isn't going anywhere, to which he asks, "Really? Are we a family?" And Sophie replies, "Yes, we're a family." Again, I think it's just another beautiful illustration of the theme we've been speaking about at length now, about how we all need love, support, and a family, whether that's people actually related to you or people you choose to make a family. Sophie makes Markl feel safe, feel loved, and feel like he has a place he belongs. And that's what allows him to literally drop the mask and stop pretending to be someone he's not. For Markl, what he needed to learn was to accept himself for who he is, so that then others can learn to do the same. Now let's quickly run through the other significant characters in the film before we finally talk about Sophie. Firstly, there's Calcifer, who's so full of duality as well. He's a shooting star, a demon, but also just regular fire. He is Howl, but he's also a separate life of his own. He is the one who gave Howl a contract, but he's the one who wants to be freed from it. He's incredibly powerful, controls the castle and who's allowed in, and yet he's also powerless to stop himself from being used by Sophie to cook breakfast on. He's described as a tricky, selfish demon, yet spends most of the film trying to help out his family. He complains about wanting to be free for the entire movie, but ends up coming right back immediately after being freed. I don't want to keep making the same point over and over and over, so I'll just succinctly say that Sophie is, of course, the person who's able to unite these dualities within him. Near the end of the film, she asks Calcifer, "If I give Howl's heart back, will it kill you?" And he simply replies, "Probably not if you do it, Sophie." She's not just the only person who's able to unify Howl, but also, ironically, Sophie is the only person capable of separating him from Calcifer. It just speaks to the artistry and complexity of Howl's moving castle that, as I've just illustrated, Sophie spends most of the film unifying everyone else, but she's also the only person capable of separating these two beings that were one. In doing so, she allows them to be more realized versions of themselves. Calcifer choosing to stay as a free being, and Howl being allowed to be whole again, with his heart back to being his own. Speaking of, there's one line from the film that I want to highlight here because, well, I just really like it. After Sophie and Howl both make it back home from the little adventure in the royal palace, Howl is looking at the new people in the room, namely the witch, the dog Heen, and the turnip scarecrow. He turns to Calcifer and asks, "Calcifer, why did you let them in?" I love this line, because this is Howl literally asking his heart why he let more people in. Questioning your own heart like this is something we might all do, because we all know that love can be painful. The duality of love is that it's the most amazing feeling in the world, but it also holds the power to hurt you more than anything else can. And so Howl is essentially asking his heart, why did you let in all this love again? Why did you accept more people into your family knowing that it could hurt you? And you know what Calcifer's response is? Don't look at me, they blew in with Sophie. Of course, the answer is Sophie. Howl loves Sophie more than anything he's ever loved before, and she gives him not just love, but a family along with it. And we'll discuss soon in her section how she fills his home in a way he's never known before. So Howl in turn then responds to Calcifer by just laughing out loud, looking at the turnip and saying, "It seems everyone in our family is a little complicated." And that, as we've hopefully done a good job illustrating so far, is exactly what the message of the film is. Everyone in all our families is a little complicated. Again, in the interest of time, let's quickly tick off the duality in the remaining two family members. Heen the dog is Madame Suliman's pet, and yet he actually sides with Sophie. He runs away with her, and despite being tasked with spying on her, he doesn't report back to Madame Suliman until after she saved Howl and ended the war by finding the lost prince, Turnip. But another really fascinating part of the character is that in the original book, he's actually not a real dog, but a man transformed into a dog. The film takes a lot of characters that were two or more people in the book and makes them one person, which should be of no surprise to you considering we spent this entire video talking about duality and how something can be many things at once. For example, in the book, the king's wizard Suliman is a man who's gone missing and who the king wants Howl to find. That's the reason the king calls Howl to the palace and why Howl doesn't want to go see him. Howl's teacher, meanwhile, is a woman named Mrs. Pentstemon, who Sophie goes to meet before she goes to the royal palace to speak with the king on Howl's behalf. The film combines these two characters into Madame Suliman, who becomes an antagonistic force for Howl. She becomes both his teacher and someone he's hiding from. Similarly, Heen is based off of a character called Percival, who starts off as a minion of the Witch of the Waste. He's a man who she turns into a dog, but who can sometimes transform back and speak a few stilted words, and he joins Sophie as a companion. As cute as Heen is, this is why I think he has that uncanny appearance where his face has quite a human look to it. I think this is the film maintaining that he is still a man turned into a dog, probably done by Madame Suliman. But it's quite fun that the film leaves this in as a sort of hidden Easter egg. Now back to the film and the family. Turnip, meanwhile, is actually a man who was transformed into a scarecrow. I find his last words in the movie to be really fascinating when it comes to our theme of love and duality. In this scene, he's just been saved by Sophie because he's given a kiss from his beloved. When he transforms back, he reveals that he's a prince from the nearby kingdom. But Sophie, meanwhile, is too busy celebrating her love with Howl. So the witch then tells Turnip that he should go end the war, and he replies that he will, but he's going to return after that because, as he says, a fickle heart is the only constant in this world. That's really interesting to me because that line applies really well to the person he's speaking to, the Witch of the Waste, who is immediately taken by him and now quickly in love with Turnip rather than Howl. But the person who this definitely doesn't apply to is Sophie, or now Howl, who maybe previously could have been accused of having a fickle heart, but now definitely doesn't. So I always find this a fascinating line in, again, how both true and untrue it is. I think that segues us nicely actually to finally talk about the most important character in the movie, Sophie. Now Sophie also has within her lots of duality, and as much as we've talked about the love she brings to others, the real journey of the film is of Sophie learning to love herself. When we meet Sophie at the start of the film, it's clear that she's not particularly enjoying life. She is in many ways an old soul trapped in a young person's body. She doesn't enjoy going out, she doesn't enjoy the company of people her age, and she doesn't at all see the beauty within herself. When the other girls ask her to go out with them, she prefers to just work on her hats instead. She's surrounded by people, and yet she's lonely. Full of paradoxes like everyone else we've discussed, it's clear that Sophie doesn't think much of herself. Ironically, it is being transformed into an old woman that actually liberates Sophie and allows her to better enjoy life. Very quickly, Sophie accepts her new fate, talking about how her clothes finally suit her and referring to herself as Grandma Sophie almost immediately. Like I said, she felt like an old soul in a young body. But the irony is that now she's completely reversed the dynamic. She becomes a young woman trapped in an old body. But at least now, she doesn't have to worry about all the things that she isn't. Sophie is able to be a more realized version of herself. When she's not worrying about how beautiful she isn't, we see she becomes more confident. After barging into the castle, we see she becomes very bold and mischievous. When the young girl I mentioned before comes to buy some remedies from Markl, she asks Sophie if she's a witch. And Sophie replies that she's the scariest witch in all the land in this really cheeky and playful tone. This is a side that we don't see of her at all when she's this shy, reclusive little mouse at the start of the film. Not long afterwards, she starts taking charge of things around the castle, declaring herself the housekeeper and bullying Calcifer into allowing breakfast to be made on him. Again, what I think is going on is that Sophie is now free from the burden of self-judgment that comes when we're younger. Especially at the kind of age Sophie is at the start of the film, when beauty and love are at the forefront of your mind, it's hard not to constantly worry about how others see you. All the women around her are talking about boys and marriage and trying their best to look beautiful, so those expectations shackle and paralyze Sophie. But when she becomes old, she's finally free to just exist without worrying about these things. And ironically, it makes her more full of life and love for herself. Early on, when Howl is away, Sophie takes the castle to a nearby lake and she just enjoys the scenery with Markl, and she says, "I've never felt such peace." A few scenes later, they're in Port Haven and Sophie tells Markl, "Isn't the sea beautiful?" And he simply replies, "It's the same as always." As a young person, Markl is taking life and all of its beauty for granted. But now that she's become old, Sophie's actually learning to stop and smell the roses and appreciate the metaphorical beauty of the little things in life. But the problem of literal beauty crops up again when she has her first argument with Howl. After Howl's hair gets dyed the wrong color, he throws a tantrum, and in the heated exchange, he says to Sophie, "What's the point of living if you're not beautiful?" This in turn makes Sophie cry and run out the house as she says, "I've had it with you, Howl. I've never once been beautiful." This little piece of dialogue here is so key and central to understanding both Sophie and Howl. At the start of the film, Howl is vain and selfish. He only lives life for its external beauty. In the book, he's a serial womanizer, and Markl actually kind of refers to this in the film too. Sophie, meanwhile, is the opposite, hating her external self, but she's someone who's full of love and consideration for others. That's why she reacts so strongly to Howl's words, because to her, what Howl is saying is essentially, "Since you're not beautiful, Sophie, your life has no value." Of course, he doesn't feel that way about Sophie, who he insists is beautiful even though she doesn't see it. But by the end of the film, they will both meet in the middle on this. Howl learns the value of what's inside when he falls in love with Sophie. He learns to care for others, to protect the things precious to him, and that outward appearances aren't everything. That's why he leaves his hair its natural color rather than dyeing it blonde again. Sophie, by contrast, learns to feel beautiful because of Howl's affirmations that she is, and she learns to love and accept herself. That's why she ends the film with her hair being grey, which Howl describes as looking like starlight. This is Sophie accepting the two parts of herself, the old soul and the young woman. She stops trying to make one or the other her entire self. She realizes that she is both. And of course, after storming out the house crying, the thing that brings Sophie back is love. It's Markl who rushes out to find her and implores her to come back, not just for him, but because Howl's tantrum is getting out of control. And out of love and concern, Sophie comes back to fix everything. Like a lot of the characters we mentioned previously, love also has a really dynamic relationship with how it affects Sophie's age. There are several moments in the film when Sophie's age visibly changes, and in fact, it's probably more accurate to say that her age is almost never fixed in the film. There are moments when she is clearly younger. For example, when Howl looks at her in this scene, he sees a young Sophie. We'll talk more about this and other examples in a second. Then when Sophie is gushing to Madame Suleiman about Howl, she again looks younger. And of course, during the climax of the film, her appearance seems to be that of a young Sophie, just with silver hair. But there's also lots of moments where Sophie's appearance seems to change right in front of our eyes. Like here when she's crying in the rain and loses her old woman hunch and even her wrinkles. Or here when they've just relocated the castle to Sophie's former home and Howl is showing her all the cool things he's added, as well as her new room. Like most Ghibli films, these things are complex and defy an obvious interpretation, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments below. But to me, the thing that unifies all these moments is love. Love again has this power to ignore the outward appearances and just see someone for the totality of their self. When Howl looks at a sleeping Sophie in that early scene, I don't think Sophie has literally gotten younger. I think we're seeing what Howl sees. This is how he perceives Sophie, as this beautiful, peaceful young woman, not the crotchety old house cleaner from before. When Sophie's in the royal palace giving her monologue about Howl, it is Madame Suleiman that replies, "Oh, you're in love with Howl." And it's the first time that thought is put out into the film. It's obvious to everyone, both in and out the film, that Sophie is brimming with love when she's saying all this. And then there's this, which I'm pretty sure is a dream sequence. When Sophie wakes up and sees Howl returning back home, then tries to help him only to be rejected. Even though this is a dream, this is the first time Sophie declares her love out loud for Howl, and so that's why I think we see her in this form. Later, when Howl has moved the castle, Sophie's initially so happy and full of love for what he's done. That's why she looks like her younger self. She's moved by Howl's gesture and she feels affection for him. But then, when she feels more self-conscious again, she regresses back to her old self. That's why when her initial emotional reaction fades and she becomes more downbeat again, she changes back to her older self and she says, "This room is perfect for a housekeeper," because she's worried that that's all she is to Howl. The reality of all of this is that when Sophie loves Howl, she feels and looks more youthful, because love is the force that gives her life and energy. But she fundamentally doesn't love herself. And that's always this tension that threatens to pull her appearance back to that of an old woman. When she feels doubt, when she feels unattractive, when she doesn't think that she's good enough, she feels old, a form that she thinks is fitting for someone who is unlovable. That's again why the resolution of the film, of how Sophie ends with this young appearance and old hair, is so important. Because again, it unifies her love for Howl with a love for herself. Now let's talk more about the love that Sophie gives to others, because it is quite gender normative. Sophie's a homemaker in its literal sense. She takes this shabby castle that's more of a dump or a frat house and turns it into a warm, cozy home for a big family. She's assigned charge of 3 unruly boys, and she essentially takes care of them all like a mother would. She makes sure they eat properly, like at the start when Michael's about to content himself with just some dodgy looking bread and cheese before Sophie cooks a proper breakfast for him. She cleans the house as the literal cleaning lady, and she gives the boys direction and purpose in their lives, telling them what to do and how to live. Out of all of Miyazaki's heroines, Sophie is perhaps the most traditional in fulfilling the role of a woman in the home. But I think that's totally okay. It's great, in fact. As much as we applaud and appreciate the badass female protagonists of Miyazaki's other films, the whole point of representation is that it should be diverse. It should encapsulate the wide range that we as human beings represent. Women should be free to be fierce, autonomous heroes, but they should also be free to be loving homemakers. The important thing is for there to not just be one way for anyone to be forced to be. And what's great about Howl's Moving Castle is the power and value it gives Sophie's traditional displays of femininity, of being empathetic and warm and nurturing. In fact, as I mentioned at the start of this video, Sophie's love is the strongest form of magic in the entire film. It ends a war, it saves multiple lives, it breaks a contract between a demon and a powerful wizard that no one else could break, it makes a rumbling walking castle fly, and it has the power to redeem even the greatest villains. In the original book by Diana Wynne Jones, Sophie is actually literally a witch. She just doesn't realize it. By the end of the book, Sophie realizes that she too has magic power, namely in the ability to breathe life into inanimate objects. The reason she's shown to be a talented hat maker is that when she talks to the hats she makes, which she does in the film too, she actually utters a charm into them by accident. So if she tells a hat, "I think you'd be worn by someone who'd marry a prince," that literally comes true, and the woman wearing it gets courted by a prince. She accidentally turns her walking stick into a magic wand in the book, and the turnip scarecrow is re-given life by Sophie's words, who had otherwise nearly lost it. But the film doesn't do any of this, and I much prefer that. In the Studio Ghibli movie, Sophie has no literal magic. She's simply a loving, nurturing person, and that is enough to change the entire world around her. And I find this to be a lot more powerful of a message. It's not fate or superpowers that make Sophie the significant character she is. It's just that she's someone so full of love that she makes everyone's lives around her better. And to me, that's the lesson of Howl's Moving Castle, and why I've spent all this time talking about the relationship between love and duality in the film. Because I think it's a beautiful message. We are all dynamic, ever-evolving, sometimes regressing creatures. Sometimes we are the best version of ourselves, sometimes we are the worst version of ourselves. But neither of those are our true selves. Our true self is in fact all of that. It is a combination of our many personalities and emotional swings and feelings. It's something I reflect on a lot myself. Like every person on earth does, I'm sure. Who am I? Am I desirable or repulsive? Am I smart or stupid? Am I creative or am I useless? When I sat down to make this video, I felt paralyzed by the success of some of my previous work. Could I really make another video that people would enjoy? Maybe that was luck. Maybe it was a fluke. But these are natural human feelings. And just like with the example of the film, I had to realize that I am all of me. The same me that made something great can also make something bad. This is true. But that wouldn't change who I am fundamentally. Within me would still be the same person with the capacity to make something great again. And so to me, love is the only answer to these ups and downs of life. To love yourself, perhaps first and foremost, to accept yourself for who you are, even as you seek to better yourself every day. But also to give love to others, to help them through these struggles, to show them that they are not their worst tendencies, and to help them accept the totality of their selves, and to receive love from those who care about us, and accept that together we can build a home, whether literally or metaphorically, that can soar through the sky with the power of love. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching all the way through, and I'm honored that you're still here. If you've enjoyed this content, then please do consider supporting me via Patreon, and I'm so grateful to my current patrons who support me, whose names you can see on screen right now. Patrons also get benefits like early access to videos, previews of what's coming up, and updates from me on what I'm doing. Patreon not only helps me keep this channel as my livelihood, but also stops me from needing to put ads into the video or take sponsorships from unethical brands, which, let's be real, is most of them. So if you'd like to see more content like this and preserve its authenticity, then you'll find the link in the video description. I'd love to know in the comments as well what you'd like to see me cover next. I'm definitely enjoying covering the Studio Ghibli work, but I'd also love to hear any other suggestions you may have, and I'm always on the lookout for great pieces of media that have a positive, uplifting message to share with the world. But that's it for now. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications on so that you don't miss another upload, and I'll be back soon enough, and I hope I'll see you there. Have a great day.